All right, let's jump right into this explainer and transport ourselves back in time. I want you to picture the foggy, neon-lit nighttime streets of 1947 Los Angeles. It was a moody, hyper-realistic world, classic black sedans rolling by, shadowy figures in fedoras walking the sidewalks. And, well, it's the very real setting for one of the most chilling, infamous, and honestly thoroughly misunderstood cold cases in American history. I'm talking, of course, about the murder of Elizabeth Short, a woman who would forever be known as the Black Dahlia.
So we have to start our investigation on a freezing January morning. It's around 10 a.m. and a local housewife named Betty Bersinger is out walking with her 3-year-old daughter. They're just running a totally normal, everyday errand, heading down to the local cobbler to pick up some shoes. But as they're walking, Betty spots this strange, white figure lying right there in the dew-covered grass of a vacant lot in Leimert Park. Now, Betty's initial reaction here really captures the sheer, unbelievable shock of the scene. At first glance, she actually thought it was a broken store mannequin, and you can understand why. The skin was stark white because it was entirely drained of blood. But tragically, this was no mannequin. The victim had been cleanly cut completely in half at the waist, she had been scrubbed completely clean with gasoline, and her body was carefully, almost theatrically posed. Betty immediately shielded her daughter's eyes and just ran to a nearby house to call the police. Which brings us to section 1 of our explainer, becoming the Black Dahlia. You know, to solve a murder, you obviously have to figure out who was murdered first. When detectives arrived, there was absolutely no identification on the body, but they did manage to lift fingerprints, and the FBI quickly identified the victim as 22-year-old Elizabeth Short. Now, what's really important to highlight here is the massive contrast between the tragic reality of Elizabeth's life and the sensational myth the media cooked up. The real Elizabeth, she was a young woman suffering from asthma, just moving between Florida and California for the milder climate. She worked as a waitress, dreamed of breaking into Hollywood. Just a normal girl. But the press immediately spun a wildly different narrative. They branded her the Black Dahlia, painting this completely fabricated picture of a promiscuous Hollywood temptress because, well, they were desperate to sell papers with a sensationalized noir mystery. And because of that media frenzy, the LAPD's investigation was severely compromised almost right out of the gate. Before police could even secure that vacant lot, a completely ruthless press corps and a bunch of curious onlookers just swarmed the area. They literally trampled over physical evidence and footprints. And guys, it gets worse. Reporters from the Examiner actually called Elizabeth's mother, Phoebe, and completely lied to her. They told her Elizabeth had won a beauty contest. Why? Just to pry personal details out of her before callously dropping the bomb that her daughter was dead. They prioritized front-page headlines over the truth, plain and simple. Let's move on to the evidence in Section 2, the surgeon's signature. Imagine vintage 1940s surgical tools resting perfectly on a stainless steel tray under a flickering dim light. This wasn't some crime of chaotic frenzy, not at all. It was a crime of cold, calculated precision. The killer cut Elizabeth completely in half using a very specific procedure taught in 1930s medical schools, something called a hemicorporectomy. This actually requires the exact disarticulation of the lumbar spine and transection of the spinal cord. The incisions were so clean, showing very little bruising, which strongly suggested the killer possessed expert anatomical or even surgical knowledge. And when you look at the coroner's report, it details an absolutely unimaginable ordeal. The killer used a knife to slash 3-inch gashes into each corner of her mouth, which is a horrifying mutilation known as a Glasgow smile. There were ligature marks on her wrists, her ankles, and her neck, indicating she'd been bound and tortured before she ultimately died from hemorrhage and shock caused by violent blows to the head. Yet because there was a total lack of blood at the Leimert Park lot, investigators knew for a fact she was murdered and completely drained of blood in a secondary location before being dumped there. So where was she before this? That brings us to Section 3, the fading silhouette. To understand who could be capable of such an atrocity, detectives had to basically retrace Elizabeth's final steps, and that led them straight into a dark timeline gap that investigators still call the missing week. On January 9th, Elizabeth arrived in Los Angeles with a salesman she had been casually dating named Robert Red Manley. He dropped her off at the luxurious Biltmore Hotel, leaving her in the lobby around 6:30 p.m. I want you to picture a beautiful 1940s woman with raven hair and a white flower, just standing in the shadows of that grand marble-floored hotel lobby, slowly fading into a dark silhouette. Because that was her last confirmed sighting. For the next 6 days, she vanished completely without a trace. Moving into Section 4, Letters from the Avenger. The mystery escalated dramatically 9 days after they discovered her body. The Los Angeles Examiner received a highly suspicious manila envelope from someone claiming to be the murderer. And get this, the envelope was soaked in gasoline. That's the exact same method the killer used to clean Elizabeth's body of fingerprints. Inside, they found ink-stained letters, Elizabeth's birth certificate, her social security card, personal photographs, and an address book belonging to a nightclub owner named Mark Hansen, with several pages just torn right out. Using cutout movie ad lettering, the sender actively taunted the police, signing off as the Black Dahlia Avenger. This single package essentially threw the LAPD into an absolute labyrinth, dealing with hundreds of false confessions. Let's dive into who might have actually done this in Section 5, the prime suspects. Working through absolute mountains of yellowed police files and black and white crime scene photos, investigators painstakingly narrowed down over 150 potential suspects, eventually zeroing in on 2 prominent men. First up, Robert "Red" Manley. He was the last person confirmed to see her alive. However, Manley cooperated fully from day one. He even passed multiple polygraph tests, which led police to definitively clear him. But on the other hand, we have Dr. George Hodel. This guy was a wealthy, highly intelligent physician who ran a local clinic. He possessed the exact surgical skills required for a hemicorporectomy. Even his own son later became totally convinced he was the killer, pointing out that Dr. Hodel was also a prime suspect in the mysterious death of his own secretary. The LAPD actually considered Hodel such a strong suspect that they bugged his house. Imagine the quiet, eerie whir of a rotating reel-to-reel tape recorder spinning in a dark room in 1950, capturing this chilling audio. On the wiretap, Hodel is literally heard saying, "Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia. They couldn't prove it now." Hearing this transcript, it really feels like peering right into the darkest shadows of history. Yet, incredibly, despite this audio and a mounting pile of circumstantial evidence, Dr. Hodel just abruptly fled the country to Asia, and the district attorney never filed charges against him. Which leads us to our final section, a legend in the shadows. As the decades rolled on, this case just grew ice cold. Crucial physical evidence has literally vanished entirely from police vaults. The real human being, Elizabeth Short, was tragically overshadowed by this terrifying, fictionalized myth of the Black Dahlia. As we wrap up this explainer, I want you to picture that vast, empty, foggy Los Angeles lot once more. A young woman with huge dreams of Hollywood met an unimaginably brutal end, and the system totally failed to deliver justice. So we are left to wonder, was the killer just a random stranger in the fog, a highly skilled surgeon, or someone entirely unsuspected? Will the shadows of 1947 ever finally yield the truth? Thank you for exploring this dark chapter with me. Keep asking questions and keep seeking the truth.